In verse 8, he says to Saul here, "You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do." He says, "Saul, you're going to wait 7 days." Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the drive-through at McDonald's or getting a coffee at Dunkin' or Starbucks, if it's like more than 5 minutes, I start to like fidget. I start to, wonder what's taking so long. This would have been a challenge for Saul. He was just anointed. Now he was called to just wait 7 days, not to do anything at all. But this was also his first test of obedience. The irony is this: later on in 1 Samuel, we will see that this is what gets him in trouble, failing to wait for Samuel. So it was in verse 9, when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those things came to pass that day. Now, you could almost say that this was the fourth sign. Everything happened on the exact same day that God told Samuel it would happen. In verse 10, when they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him there. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. Now you might be scratching your head and wondering, what exactly is going on here? This is not Saul's regular hangout crew. He sees this group of prophets, and here's what this, social group looked like. They were often young. 2 Kings tells us that. They frequently lived together. They frequently ate together. They were supported by the generosity of the Israelites. It appears that Samuel provided direction for this movement in its early stages, and later, Elijah and Elisha would have done that. But as the Spirit of God comes upon him, likely in the context of offering praise to God, he's transformed. And as in other places in the Old Testament, just as God empowered that person for ministry, now Saul, he's empowered for ministry, right? He's declaring the praise of God here. He's more than likely, has a change in heart, and he's, testifying to God's goodness and God's greatness here, right? As the Spirit of God comes upon him. And it happened in verse 11, all who knew him formerly said that he indeed prophesied among the prophets. That the people said to one another, "What is it that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" Remember that phrase there. Then a man from there answered and said, "But who is their father?" Then it became a proverb. Is Saul also among the prophets? Here's what this means. Saul is not known for his faith, probably not known for his spirituality or his religion. Yet, God changes him. And this proverb starts, "Is Saul among the prophets?" It was meant to convey God's ability to drastically change someone. You can imagine two people having a conversation, and maybe they're talking about someone that possibly can never be changed. And one person would reply, "Well, is Saul among the prophets?" And it would be a reminder, hey, wait up. God can change anyone. He can change even the most vilest of people. And so that becomes a proverb here in the nation of Israel. Now I want to read the story to you. It was published in the New York Times back in 2017, and the title of the story is "The Jihadi Who Turned to Jesus." This is a long story. It'll take a few minutes to read, but it's really worth it to show how God can change a person just as he changed Saul. So grab a coffee if you want. But it starts here when 22 Christian refugees gathered in the basement of an apartment in Istanbul early on a recent Sunday afternoon. It was quickly clear that this was no ordinary prayer meeting. And this is written by a New York Times journalist. His name is Patrick Kingsley. I want to give him credit. Several of them had Islamic names. There was an Abdulrahman and even a couple of Muhammads. Strangest of all, they jokingly referred to their host, one of the two Muhammads, as an Irabi, which is a terrorist. If Bashir Muhammad took the joke well, it was because there was once some truth to it. Today, Mr. Muhammad, 25, has a cross on his wall and invites other recent converts to weekly Bible readings in his purple wall living room. Less than 4 years ago, however, he says he fought on the front lines of the Syrian civil war for the Nusra Front, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. He says, a jihadi who turned to Jesus. Think about this. When this is being written, this guy 4 years ago, right, was a complete, blown out, full-blown terrorist. And I'll keep reading this. It is a transition that has surprised everyone, not least of all himself. 4 years ago, Mr. Muhammad tells me, frankly, I would have slaughtered anyone who suggested it. So 4 years ago, he would have killed anyone. Not only have his beliefs changed, but his temperament has too. Today, his wife, Heaven Rashid, confirms, with a hint of understatement, that he is much better to be around. The conversion of Muslim refugees to Christianity is not a new phenomenon, particularly in majority Christian countries. Converts sometimes stand accused of trying to enhance their chances of asylum by making it dangerous to deport them back to places with a history of Islamist persecution. Mr. Muhammad's particular experience, however, does not easily fit into this narrative. He lives in a majority Muslim country, has little interest in seeking asylum in the West, and treads an unlikely path followed by a few former jihadis. His is a story that began in a Kurdish port of northern Syria, Afrin, where he grew up in a Muslim family. Mr. Muhammad flirted with extremism in his teens. His cousin took him to hear jihadist preachers as a 15-year-old, and he adhered to some of the most extreme interpretations of Islam, even the ones you haven't heard of. But when war broke out in Syria, after the country's 2011 uprising, Mr. Muhammad initially joined the secular Kurdish forces in their fight for autonomy. Mr. Muhammad's subsequent ideological journey rarely made complete sense, but by his account, he became traumatized by the deaths he witnessed on the front line, which in turn re-energized his interest in the extremist versions of Islam that he had learned about as a teenager. Now listen to what he says. When I saw all these dead bodies, he said, it made me believe all these things they said in all the lectures. It made me seek the greatness of religion, or at least his violent interpretation of that religion. When a friend invited him to defect in summer 2012 to the Nusra Front, a group that seeks to establish an extremist state, Mr. Muhammad readily agreed. As a Nusra fighter, now remember this name, Nusra fighter, he continued to witness extreme brutality. His colleagues executed several captives by crushing them with a bulldozer. Another prisoner was forced to drink several liters of water after his genitals were tied shut with string. This time, however, Nusra's propaganda made the violence seem tolerable. They used to tell us these people were the enemies of God, Mr. Muhammad said, so I looked on these executions positively. When I first met Mr. Muhammad in his basement, I guessed at none of this. In fact, I was there to observe one of his guests, a Yahtzee who had converted 2 months earlier. Mr. Muhammad seemed to be the group's glue and behaved as though he had been born and bred a Christian. It was Mr. Muhammad who led the first prayers and chants. People who have fled their homes, began one. God bring them safety. And it was he who distributed the coffee afterward. His calm poise was jogged only when his guests jokingly referred to him as Irabi, a sobriquet that sent a sheepish smile across his youthful face. In his previous life, however, Mr. Muhammad said that he was an angry man whose temper frightened his relatives. When he briefly returned home for his family's Kurdish New Year celebrations in March 2013, Mr. Muhammad was repulsed by what he saw as blasphemous celebrations whose origins lay outside the Islamic tradition. Indoctrinated by his months with Nusra, he spent his leave in isolation with Miss Rashid, who was then his fiancée. Both she and his parents tried to persuade him not to return to the front line, but he ignored them. But back at the front, Mr. Muhammad finally began to question Nusra's motives. Scanning government territory through his binoculars, he says he saw Syrian government soldiers executing a line of prisoners with a bulldozer, and concluded there was little difference between their behavior and that of his colleagues. Disenchanted, he risked execution himself by deserting Nusra and returned home to Afrin. Now listen to what he says. I went to Nusra in search of my God, he said, but after I saw Muslims killing Muslims, I realized there was something wrong. The next year, He and his wife fled the war entirely, leaving for Istanbul and joining around 2.5 million other Syrians in exile in Turkey. Still a zealous Muslim, Mr. Muhammad prayed so loudly that his upstairs neighbors complained. They used to ask me, when are you going to turn into a prophet? He still required Miss Rashid to cover her hair and neck and planned for her to wear a niqab, a full face covering. It was nevertheless Miss Rashid herself who unwittingly prompted her husband's rejection of Islam. In early 2015, she fell seriously ill. As her health worsened, Mr. Muhammad described her condition in a phone call with his cousin Ahmed, the same cousin who had taken him to jihadist lectures as a teenager. Ahmed was now living in Canada, and in a move that shocked Mr. Muhammad, had converted to Christianity. An enthusiastic convert, Ahmad asked Mr. Muhammad to place his telephone close to Miss Rashid so that his prayer group could sing and pray for her health. Think about that. This is happening over the phone here. They're praying for this Muslim extremist's wife. Horrified, Mr. Muhammad initially refused, since he had been taught to find Christianity repellent. But he was also desperate, and eventually he gave in. When Miss Rashid improved within a few days, Mr. Muhammad ascribed it to his cousin's intervention. Intrigued, he then began to entertain a sacrilegious thought. He asked his cousin to recommend a Christian preacher in Istanbul who might introduce him to the religion. He was put in touch with Imad Brim, a missionary from an evangelical group based in Jordan called the Good Shepherd, who agreed to meet with him. Mr. Brim said Mr. Muhammad was quickly persuaded by the benefits of a conversion, despite the lethal danger in which it would place him. It was Bashir who was looking for Amid, said Mr. Brim, who also confirmed the other parts of Mr. Muhammad's narrative. It was easy. Exactly why he sought solace in Christianity rather than a more mainstream version of Islam, no one can quite explain. Reading the Bible, Mr. Muhammad claimed, made him calmer than reading the Quran. The churches he attended, Mr. Muhammad said, made him feel more welcome than the neighborhood mosque. In his personal view, Christian prayers were more generous than Muslim ones. But these are subjective claims, and many would reject the characterization of Islam as a less benign religion, much as they would reject Nusra's extremist interpretation of it. Now listen to this. For Mr. Muhammad and Miss Rashid, perhaps it was their dreams that sealed their conversion. So they start getting these dreams even after she's healed. As the couple began to consider leaving Islam, Miss Rashid said she dreamed of a biblical figure who used heavenly powers to divide the waters of the sea, which Mr. Muhammad interpreted as a sign of encouragement from Jesus. Then Mr. Muhammad himself dreamed Jesus had given him some chickpeas. Now think about that, right? Jesus appearing to him in a dream with chickpeas. The pair felt loved. There's a big gap between the God I used to worship and the one I worship now, Mr. Muhammad said. We used to worship in fear. Now everything has changed. For Mr. Muhammad, all this has nevertheless come at a high price. His rejection of Islam makes him a target for his fundamentalist former allies, and he fears that one day they will catch up with him. If they do, however, he reckons he now has the greatest protection of all. I trust God, he says. Now coming back to scripture, I know that was a long story, but worth it. We see this amazing conversion. We see a man, not just a Muslim, an extremist fighter, right, on the front lines in Syria. He wants to establish an extremist state. He comes to Christ, right, through his conscience, seeing other Muslims being killed. He comes to Christ through his wife's sickness and his cousin praying over the phone. He comes to Christ through dreams him and his wife has. He sees Jesus giving him chickpeas, and he feels the warmth of a God that loves him. That phrase, right, the Israelites said about Saul, is Saul among the prophets? You see, that could be your name. That could be my name. Or maybe someone you don't know. Never underestimate God's ability to drastically change your life or my life.